In this ASMR episode, I will read the second part of the book George's Marvellous Medicine from Roald Dahl in ASMR style. RSMR Katz. Hey, and thank you for clicking on this video clip. I will read now the second part of this book, George's Marvellous Medicine. I already read the first part, but the book is a little bit bigger, so I thought I will push it into two different parts. So if you don't have read already the first part, then click yourself to my ASMR clips and find the first part of this book, and then come later on to the second part to read the second part of the book. And it is absolutely worth it to listen to. My name is ASMR Katz, and I warmly welcome you to my YouTube channel, where I will take you on the satisfaction of sound. I would be honored if you can like, subscribe, click on the notification bell and comment, because every support makes this project here happen. So let us start directly with the second part. And before I forgot, this is a high quality recording. So I have here headphones because all of these instruments make the best satisfaction of ASMR sound. So when you put your headphone in your ear and lean back and enjoy, you can listen to my voice and can relax to this kind of ASMR atmosphere. The Brown Hen. George stood in the farmyard looking up at the roof. The old farmer house had a fine roof of pale red tiles and tall chimneys. There was no sign of Grandma. There was only a song thrush sitting on of the chimney post, singing a song. The old wurzels got stuck in the attack, George thought. Thank goodness for that. Suddenly, a tile came clattering down from the roof and fell into the yard. The song of thrush took off fast and flew away. Then another tile came down, then a half dozen more. And then, very slow, like some weird monster rising up from the deep, Grandma's head came through the roof. Then her scrawny neck and the tops of her shoulders. How I'm doing, boy, she shouted. How's that for a bush-up? Don't you think you do better stop now, Grandma? George called out. I have stopped, she answered. I feel terrific. Didn't I tell you I had a magic powers? Didn't I warn you I had a wizardly in the tips of my fingers? But you wouldn't listen to me, would you? You wouldn't listen to your old grandma. You didn't do it, Grandma, George shouted back there. I did. I made you a new medicine. A new medicine? You? What rubbish, she yelled. I did, George shouted. You're lying as usual, Grandma yelled. There, you're always lying. I'm not lying, Grandma, I swear I'm not. The wrinkled old face high up on the roof stared down suspiciously at George. Are you telling me you actually made a new medicine all by yourself? Yes, Grandma, all by myself. I don't believe you, she answered, but I'm very comfortable up here. Fetch me a cup of tea. A brown hen was pecking about in the yard close to where George was standing. The hen gave him an idea. Quickly, he uncorked the medicine bottle and poured some of the brown stuff into the spoon. "Watch this, Grandma," he shouted. He crouched down, holding out the spoon to a hen. "Chicken," he said. "Chicken, chick. Come here, have some of this." Chickens are stupid birds and very greedy. They think everything is food. This one thought the spoon was full of corn. It hopped over. It put its head on the side and looked at the spoon. "Come on, chicken," George said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." The brown hen stretched out its neck towards the spoon and went peck. It got a break full of medicine. The effect was electric. "Ooh," shrieked the hen, and it shot straight up into the air like a rocket. It went as high as a house. Then down it came again into the yard, splosh, and there it sat with its feathers all sticking straight out from its body. There was a look of amazement on its silly face. George stood watching it. Grandma up on the roof was watching it too. The hen got its feet. It was rather shaky. It was making funny gurgling noise in his throat. Its beak was opening and shutting. It seemed like a pretty sick hen. "You've done it, you stupid boy," Grandma shouted. "That hen's going to die. Your father be after you now. He give you socks and serve you right." All of a sudden, black smoke started pouring out of the hen's beak. "It's on fire," Grandma yelled. "The hen is on fire." George ran to the water trough to get a bucket of water. Then the hen be roasted and ready for eating in a moment, Grandma shouted. George slushed the bucket of water over the hen. There was a sizzling sound and the smoke went away. "Old hen's laid its last egg," Grandma shouted. "Hens don't do anything after they've been on fire." Now that the fire was out, the hen seemed better. It stood up properly. It flapped its wings. Then it crashed down low to the ground as though getting ready to jump. It did jump. It jumped high in the air and turned a complete somersault, then landed back on its feet. "It's a circus hen," Grandma shouted from the top. It flapping with a crop. Now the hen began to grow. George had been waiting for this to happen. "It's growing," he yelled. "It's growing, Grandma. Look how it's growing." Bigger and bigger, taller and taller it grew. Soon the hen was 4 or 5 times as normal size. "Can you see it, Grandma?" George shouted. "I can see it, boy," the old girl shouted back. "I'm watching it." George was hopping about from one foot to the other with excitement, pointed at the enormous hen and shouting, "It's had the magic medicine, Grandma, and it's growing just like you did." But there was a difference between the way the hen was growing and the way the grandma was growing. When the grandma grew taller and taller, she got thinner and thinner. Then hen didn't. It stayed nice and plump all along. Soon it was taller than George, but it didn't stop there. It went right on growing until it was about as big as a horse. Then it stopped. "Doesn't it look marvelous, Grandma?" George shouted. "It's not as tall as me," Grandma sang out. "Compared with me, that hen is a itchy small. I am the tallest of them all." The pig, the bullocks, the sheep, the pony, and the nanny goat. At that moment, George's mother came back from shopping in the village. She drove her car into the yard and got out. She was crying, a bottle of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. The first thing she saw was the gigantic brown hen towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk. Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop, and when she looked up and saw Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles, she dropped the bag of groceries. "How about that, then, Mary?" Grandma shouted, "I'll bet you never seen a hen as big as that." "That's George's giant hen, that is." "But," stammered George's mother. "It's George's magic medicine," Grandma shouted. "We both of us had it. Then the hen and I." "But how in the world did you get up on the roof?" cried the mother. "I didn't," crackled the old woman. "My feet are still standing on the floor in the living room." This was too much for George's mother to understand. She just goggled and gaped. She looked as though she was going to faint. A second later, George's father appears. His name was Mr. Kylie Cranky. Mr. Cranky was a small man with bendy legs and a huge head. He was a kind father to George, but he was not an easy person to live with, because even the smallest things got him all worked up and excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing, and when Mr. Cranky saw it, he started to jump about as thought something was burning his feet. "Great heaven!" he cried, waving his arms. "What is this? What has happened? Where did it come from? Is it a giant hen? Who did this?" "I did," George said. "Look at me," Grandma shouted from the rooftop. "Never mind about the hen. What about me?" Mr. Krant looked up and saw Grandma. "Shut up, Grandma," he said. It didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl was sticking up the throat through the roof. It was the hen that excited him. He had never seen anything like that. But then, who had? "It's fantastic," Mr. Cranky shouted, dancing round and round. "It's colossal. It's gigantic. It's tremendous. It's it's a miracle." "How did you get to do it, George?" George started telling his father about the magic medicine. While he was doing this, the big brown hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went cluck, cluck, cluck. Everyone stared at it. When it stopped again, there was a brown egg lying there. The egg was the size of a football. "The egg would make scrambled eggs for 20 people, Mr. Cranky said. "George," Mr. Cranky shouted, "how much of the medicine have you got?" "Lots," George said. "There's a big saucepan full in the kitchen, and this bottle here is nearly full." "Come with me," Mr. Cranky yelled, grabbing George by the arm. "Bring the medicine." "For years and years, I've been trying to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, bigger sheep for mutton. They want to be the biggest." George gave a spoonful of medicine to the pig. The pig blew in smoke from its nose and jumped all over the place. Then it grew. And in the end, it looked like this. They went to the herd of a fine black bulldogs that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for the market. George gave each of them medicine, and this is what happened. Then the sheep. He gave some to his grey pony, and finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat. A crane for Grandma. Grandma from high up on the rooftop could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the center of attention, and nobody was talking the slightest noise of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running around and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was alone on the rooftop. "Hey you," she yelled. "George, get me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast." "Don't listen to the old gold," Mr. Cranky said. "She's stuck where she is, and a good thing too." "But we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George," Grandma yelled. "Oh, you horrible little boy, you disgusting little worm, fetch me a cup of tea at once and slice of a currant cake." "We have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give us any peace if we don't." Mr. Cranky came outside, and she agreed with George. "She's my own mother," she said. "She's a pain in the neck," Mr. Cranky said. "I don't care," Mrs. Cranky said. "I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life." So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send the biggest crane of this house at once. The crane arrived an hour later. It was one wheels and there were two men inside it. The crane man climbed up on the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms. Then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her in any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped on his back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped about the farm, and the giant pony, jumping over trees and sheets and shouting, "Out of my way, clear the disc, stand back, all you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you to death," and other silly things like that. But because Grandma was now much tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. Mr. Cranky's great idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvelous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant saucepan had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and few made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Killicrank, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we will sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have a giant animal. We will build a marvelous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at £5 a time. We will become rich and you will become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why won't they?" asked George. "Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It's changed the world." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying, 'Wait a minute,'" shouted Mr. Cranky. "There isn't a minute to wait. We must go and get cracking at once." "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "The heck with my cornflakes," cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. "Come on, George, let's get going." And the first thing we do is to make one more saucepan full as a test. But Dad, said little George, the trouble is... There won't be any trouble, boy, cried Mr. Cranky. How can there possibly be any trouble? All you got to do is put the same stuff into the saucepan as you did yesterday. And while you are doing it, I will write down each and every item. That's how we get the magic recipe. But Dad, said George, please listen to me. Why don't you listen to him? Mrs. Cranky said. The boy is trying to tell you something. But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. And then he cried, when the new mixture is ready, we will test it out on an old hen, just to make absolutely sure we got it right. And after that, we shout hooray and build the giant factory. But Dad, come on then, what is it you want to say? I can't possibly remember all hundreds of giant things I put in the saucepan to make the medicine, George said. Of course you can, my dear boy, cried Mr. Cranky. I will help you. I'll jog your memory. You get in the end. You see if you don't. Now, then, what was the first thing you put in? I went up in the bathroom first, George said. I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table. Come on then, cried Mr. Kelly Cranky. Up we go to the bathroom. When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerials and empty bottles. That's great, said Mr. Cranky. That tells us exactly what you use. If anything is empty, it means you used it. So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. A box of powder, said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. Helga's hair set, flowers of turnips parfum. Terrific, this is going to be easy. Where did you go next? To the laundry room, George said. But are you sure you haven't missed anything out of here, Daddy? That's up to you, my boy, Mr. Cranky said. Have I? I don't think so, George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. My goodness me, what a mess of stuff you used, he cried. No wonder it did magic things. It's a lot. No, Dad, it's not, George said, and he led his father out of the sheet where the animal medicine were kept and showed him the 5 empty big bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all the names. Anything else? Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Killicrank leaped into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on his list. He then went to the vet and got fresh supply of all the animals' medicine George had used. Now show me how you did it, George, he said. Come along, show me exactly how you mixed them all together. Marvelous medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. Come along, my boy, cried Mr. Killicranky. Which do you put in first? This one, George said. Golden Gloss hair shampoo. He emptied the bottle in the pan. Now the toothpaste, George went on, and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail varnish. Keep at it, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky, dancing around in the kitchen. Keep putting them in. Don't stop. Don't pause. Don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch your work. One by one, George poured and squeezed the things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, The whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the saucepan didn't somehow seem to be quite as full as it had been the first time. "Now, what did you do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you steer it?" "I boiled it," George said. "But not for long, and I steer it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he had used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" cried Mr. Crank. "Tell me quick." "Because if we have forgotten even one tiny thing, then it won't work, at least not in the same way." "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I have forgotten." Mr. Killicrank shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and bought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the pen into the saucepan. "Ah, that's better," George said. "That's more like the right color." "It's boiling," cried Mr. Crank. "It's boiling and bubbling, George. It's ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "At least I hope it is." "Right," shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give some to a chicken." "My heavens alive, why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down?" cried Mr. Cranky. "You expect me to calm down, and here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world." "Come along, George. Dip a cupful out of the saucepan and get a spoon, and we'll give some to a chicken, just to make absolutely certain we got the correct mixture." Outside in the yard, there were several chickens that hadn't any of George's marvelous medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt in the silly way chickens do. George crushed down, holding out a spoonful of marvelous medicine number 2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with black speaks on its feathers looked up to George. It walked over the spoon and went pick. The effect that the medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect that produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. Whoosh, shred the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up in the air and came down again. Then sparks came flying out of his beak, bright yellow sparks of fire. It thought someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killicranky. "Something went wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up in the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd with his long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, my sainted ounce," cried Mr. Killicranky. "We got it wrong. This chicken's no good to anybody. It's our legs. No one wants chicken legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think, what was it you left out?" "I've got it," said George. "What was it, quick?" "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer." "Wait a minute," said George. "Did we have brown shoe polish on our list?" "We did not," said Mr. Cranky. "I used that too." "Well, No wonder it went wrong, said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was hiding down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. Marvelous medicine number 3. Here it is, cried Mr. Kelly Cranky, rushing into the kitchen. 1 carton of flea powder for dogs, and 1 tin of brown shoe polish. George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. Stir it up, George, shouted Mr. Cranky. Give it another boil. We got this time. I bet we got it. After marvelous medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it out into the yard to try at another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. Come and watch this one, he called out to Mrs. Cranky. Come and watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as a football's. I hope you do better than last time, said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. Come on, chicken, said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. Good chicken, chick, chick, chick. Have some of this lovely medicine. A magnificent black crocoll with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The crocoll looked at the spoon and it went peck. Cock-a-doodle-doo, squawked the crocoll, shooting up in the air and coming down again. Watch him now, cried Mr. Crank. Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger. Mr. Kelly Cranky, Mrs. Cranky, and little George stood in the yard staring at the black cockle. The cockle stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. What's happening to its neck? Mrs. Cranky said. It's getting longer. I say it's getting longer, Mrs. Cranky said. Mr. Cranky for once said nothing. Last time it was the legs, Mrs. Cranky said. Now it is the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck. It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body had grown at all, but the neck was now about 6 feet long. All right, George, Mr. Cranky said. What else have you forgotten? I don't know, said George. Oh, yes, you do, Mr. Cranky said. Come along, boy, think. There's probably just one vital thing missing, and you have to remember it. It put in some engine oil from the garage, George said. Did you have that on your list? Eureka, cried Mr. Cranky. That's the answer. How much did you put in? Half a pint, George said. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another half pint of oil. And some antifreeze, George called after him. I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze. Marvelous medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. Boil it up again, cried Mr. Cranky. Boil it and stir it. George boiled it and stirred it. You never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget you don't just have the same things, but you've got to have exactly the same amount of those things. And how you can possibly do that? You keep out of this, cried Mr. Crank. We are doing fine. We got it this time. You see if we haven't. This was George's marvelous medicine number 4. And when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cup full of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You are going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this, she said. Dish it out, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give a spoonful to that one over there. He pointed to a brown hen. George kneeled down and held out the spoon with the new medicine in it. Chick, chick, he said. Try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went peck. Ouch, it said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of his beak. Watch it grow, shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be too sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like this? Keep quiet, Walnut, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it a chance. They stood there staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched chicken. It looked ridiculous. Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came staring into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and she shouted, What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast. I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We got been terrible blissy. I'll get you something right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Oh, she cried. So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself, all right, don't you? You make quite sure you got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one of your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig. No, Grandma, George said, that isn't. Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here, it's mine. No, cried Mrs. Cranky, no, Mother, don't, that's not for you. Now, you're against me too, shouted Grandmother. My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge, horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, Grandma, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You are not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's marvellous. Everything George's round here, shouted Grandma. George this, George that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup off the little George's hand and carried it high up out of the reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, drinking ugly, lovely tea. No, the other two cried, but it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, You just drank 50 doses of George's marvellous medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to the little old brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear it. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Now, you done it," cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shouting out of Grandmother's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst." "Stand clear," Mr. Crank said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill that it hurt the ears. "Call the fire barrage," cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police. Man the hose pipes." "Too late," said Mrs. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma shrieked, "Mrs. Cranky, Mother, run to the drinking through and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with a head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "What's this, George?" Mr. Crank shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happened. Someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half of a minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Miss Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it had always had. Her eyes, now bigger than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She is still getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, "How do I stop getting her small?" "You can," said Mr. Cranky. "She had 50 times the right amount." "It must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumping seed. And then, "Where is she?" cried Mr. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of your George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes Mr. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where you gone? Where you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Ah, well, I suppose it's all for the best." She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? Nuisance. Never heard this word. Yes, Mr. Cranky said. She most certainly was. George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic word. And this was the book George's Marvelous Medicine from Roald Dahl. I read it in 2 sequences. So if you now or just listen to the second part, click yourself through my timeline to find the first part of the book to get the full story. I have here the full Roald collection and the book's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you are interested, follow, subscribe, click on the notification bell and let a comment here that I can read even more books in the future here on my ASMR channel. And Roald Dahl have a few amazing books waiting for you. He wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Fabric and Matilda, where you might know the book from. And these stories as well, who are very entertaining for young people and also for adults. So no matter which age you have, this could be your way to calm down, to relax, and to listen to the words I whisper in your ear. My name is ASMR Katz, and I am your heavily tattooed red girl who shows you the satisfaction of sound. And I hope that you don't take this marvelous medicine too serious. But if you do, let me know what it does to you. Send me your pictures afterwards. And otherwise, I just wish you a very good and happy time wherever you are right now on this earth. Tell all your friends about my channel, and if you are able to see the beauty behind ASMR, then feel free to click on all the other videos I have in stock for you. And if you are more interested in a person like me, then check out the section where I read all about the video itself, because there I also have some links for you waiting that show you my adult entertainment world. And now I also will put out my headphones and will stop the video. And I hope that I will see you the next time here as well on my ASMR YouTube channel. And until then, don't let yourself stressed. Enjoy and live a good life.